All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center's Center for Biological Diversity's quarterly biodiversity briefing. I am Gretchen Mays. I'm the Center's membership director, and I'm filling in for Paula Simmons today. Our briefing today is going to be brought to you by a couple of our amazing experts. We have senior scientist and wildlife corridor advocate, Tiffany Yap, and our deputy director from Florida, Elise Bennett. Kieran, unfortunately, was not able to make it today, but we're also joined by Joe Malisi and a wonderful behind-the-scenes crew from the Center's membership team. On behalf of everyone at the Center, I'd like to relay how truly grateful we are for your generous support, and we really appreciate that you've taken the time to join us today to learn more about the Center's work. Elise and Tiffany will be discussing the Center's campaigns and legal work to expand wildlife connectivity and save habitat for endangered species. During the conversation today, everyone will be muted to cut down on background noise, and we'll turn on your audio and make that available again during the question and answer session at the end of the presentations. Today's call is being recorded, and we'll email a recording out in the next couple of days. And thank you all for being on the call today. I'm going to turn it over first to Tiffany Yap.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Alrighty, so hopefully everyone can see that. If not, please let us know. All right, so I am Tiffany Yap. I am a senior scientist and wildlife connectivity advocate in the Urban Wildlands program at the Center, and I'm excited to talk to you all today about our work protecting pumas and wildlife connectivity in the urban wildland interface. And so first, I just wanted to give a quick definition of what the urban wildland interface is. It is the transition zone between human development and undeveloped wildlands. It's places that you might think about from your childhood. If you spent time in nature, maybe the creek near your house, or the field by your school, or maybe the nearby park where you met friends. It's often where people have their first interaction with nature, and it's where people and wildlife share space and interact the most. It's also where a lot of impacts of habitat loss and fragmentation are happening and need to be remedied. And so just as an example, roads are a huge barrier to wildlife movement. They fragment habitats and affect a really wide variety of species. We have wide-ranging animals like pumas and bears and deer, but roads also really affect smaller, less mobile species like snakes and salamanders and insects. Roads affect birds, roads affect fish. They just affect such a wide variety of taxa. And it really is something that is very concerning. It's a little bit difficult to quantify the scale of the impacts to animals because there are a lot of data gaps. But we do have some estimates, and those estimates show that lack of connectivity affects wildlife and people. So in California, the UC Davis Road Ecology Center recently reported that over 44,000 collisions with large mammals were reported in California between 2016 and 2020. And these crashes can be very harmful, not just to these animals, but also to people. So about 5 people are killed every year, and 250 people sustain injuries every year due to these types of collisions. And the UC Davis estimated that costs from human loss of life, injuries, and also property damage are estimated to be up to or more than $1 billion for that 2016 to 2020 timeframe. And what's really frightening is that a lot of these kinds of collisions go unreported, and these numbers could actually be 3 to 9 times higher. And then that's only talking about large mammals. So we're also concerned about other species. Up to 340 million birds are killed on roads every year in the US. And we don't really have any numbers for amphibians and reptiles or other small critters or insects. But to highlight the potential magnitude of the issue for some of these smaller critters, I just wanted to provide an example of this iNatural Community Science project where they really documented the impacts of one road on newts migrating between their upland habitat and their breeding pools. So these community scientists went out between 2018 and 2021 at the Lexington Reservoir, and they documented over 23,000 dead California newts on just a 4-mile stretch of road. And when scientists looked into it further, they estimated that this particular population is experiencing about 40% annual mortality rate on this road every year. And they speculated that newts could become locally extinct within decades if nothing is done to improve connectivity for them. But luckily, we do know of effective solutions that can be implemented to address these issues. Wildlife crossings, when they're properly planned, have been shown to decrease wildlife vehicle collisions by up to 98%, and they've been shown to facilitate wildlife movement. We've seen animals using crossings, and we've seen plant diversity increase after connectivity is restored. And also, these types of crossings are cost effective. The savings over the long term from prevented collisions surpass the initial cost of the crossing. And then sometimes the previous slide had overpasses and underpasses and culverts, but sometimes wildlife crossings can just be upgraded culverts. So these are examples where ramps were built at existing culverts so that animals could access them and cross the road safely. So a lot of our work involves pushing for functional wildlife crossings to reconnect habitats and maintain healthy ecosystems. Our California mountain lion work is an example of how we're pushing to improve wildlife connectivity while protecting a sensitive species at the same time. So in 2019, the center petitioned for mountain lions in Southern California and along the Central Coast to be listed as threatened under the California Endangered Species Act. And this was very much motivated by a study that came out in 2018 that showed that roads and development were fragmenting populations so much that they're forming genetically distinct populations throughout California. And so each color on this map represents a genetically distinct subpopulation. And there are 6 subpopulations in Southern California and along the Central Coast, and some of them are experiencing an extinction vortex. For example, mountain lion populations in the Santa Ana Mountains and the Santa Monica Mountains have such low genetic diversity and such high levels of inbreeding that if we don't improve wildlife connectivity and inbreeding gets worse, scientists predict that they could become locally extinct within 50 years. And so there are several factors that play into the extinction vortex, and they're all human caused. So again, there's the inbreeding due to the boxing in by roads and development and the low, and then that leads to low genetic diversity. They're being killed on roads, they're being killed after depredation events, they're being killed by rat poison, by disease, by poaching, by wildfire. There's all these different reasons, or all these different factors that play into this extinction vortex. And the primary driver of all of this is, again, lack of connectivity. And so there are a lot of reasons why we want to protect mountain lions. They are a keystone species. They also have intrinsic value. They're a very iconic species, and people really love them. So they have high cultural value. They're also really important ecosystem engineers. Their kills provide a reliable food source, not just for themselves, but also for a wide swath of scavengers. So bears and foxes, eagles and condors, beetles and other invertebrates that help keep the soil healthy, that then allow plants to be able to thrive. The mountain lions, they also modify behavior of other species throughout the landscape, and that helps kind of, it influences how the landscape looks and how it functions. So they really support a wide variety of biodiversity, and a 2022 study found that pumas actually have ecological interactions with about 500 different animal and plant species. And so really we need to improve wildlife connectivity so that these populations can survive and thrive. So protecting these populations under CISA would help us move towards the goal of safe coexistence, particularly because people are, again, the primary cause, are causing the deaths of many of these animals. It would require preserving, enhancing existing connectivity, and reconnecting habitat by building greener infrastructure. So more wildlife crossings would always be very helpful. It would also help limit rat poisons and minimize conflict with people by creating education and awareness about the importance of keeping pets indoors at night and keeping farm animals in puma-proof enclosures at night. So the CISA status is a fairly long process, but just to give a quick rundown of where we're at now. So we petitioned for listing in 2019, and in 2020, they were advanced to candidacy. And so now they have CISA protections while CDFW conducts a status review and we get a formal vote, but that's a little bit down the road. But since we did petition, we've already seen some positive signs, which is really exciting. The state implemented a 3-step depredation policy statewide, which prioritizes non-lethal measures to prevent depredation. And since that has been implemented, we've seen an 80% reduction in reported depredation kills. And so that's pretty exciting to see. We also fight poorly planned projects in the urban wildland interface that threaten pumas and wildlife connectivity. So for example, in 2020, we obtained a legal agreement through a lawsuit against the Altair project to protect a critical wildlife connectivity area for the struggling Santa Ana puma population. And in 2021, judges blocked 2 other projects that we filed lawsuits against. So that they're both in LA County. That's the North Lake project and the Centennial project. And these projects would have harmed mountain lions and other sensitive species like Western spadefoot toad. And they also threatened wildlife connectivity. They're in really important wildlife connectivity areas. In addition to litigation, we also push for legislation and ordinances at the local and regional level to protect and enhance wildlife connectivity for pumas, as well as other wildlife. So we have the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act, which is AB 2344, and the center sponsored this bill along with the Wildlands Network. And right now, basically what it does is it would require the state to develop a wildlife connectivity action plan and a statewide priority project list where crossings are needed. And then it would require the state to incorporate wildlife connectivity into new transportation projects. And that has gone through the California Assembly, and it is now moving through the Senate, and we're hoping to get that to the governor's desk by later this year. We also supported the Ventura County Wildlife Movement and Habitat Connectivity Ordinances, and those together, they identified important connectivity areas and limit development in those areas. And so when industry groups, it passed, and then when industry groups challenged the ordinances in court, the center joined a coalition of other organizations to defend it, and we were able to successfully defend it. So it is still in place. We're also working with the city of LA to draft a wildlife ordinance, which aims to preserve open space and encourage wildlife-friendly infrastructure. And then we also support connectivity enhancement projects, whether it's through increasing awareness about them or about the importance of wildlife crossings and wildlife connectivity, submitting letters of support for funding to go towards certain projects, or pushing to decision makers to prioritize these types of projects. And so here are just a few examples of some of the crossings that we have supported. Maybe some of you have heard of the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing, which is in LA. And it's going to be the largest wildlife bridge in the world, crossing over 10 lanes of freeway on the 101. And it would help the pumas in Santa Monica Mountains, but also a lot of other wildlife there as well. And so the Rainbow Canyon Crossing and the Laurel Curve Crossing are under crossings that would help pumas, again, in Southern California and along the Central Coast. And we're also supporting new connectivity enhancement on Alma Bridge Road, which is where that Lexington Reservoir iNaturalist project is, where we help to prevent new development until new connectivity is addressed. And we are supporting studies to identify hotspots and appropriate mitigation, and then implementation of that mitigation. And so that's some of the work that we're doing to protect pumas and wildlife connectivity in the urban wildland interface. And with that, I just want to leave you with this heartwarming footage that I think really captures the vibe of why wildlife connectivity is so important. So that's it. Thank you.
I just love that clip so much. Thank you so much, Tiffany. And now we'll go ahead and pass it now to Elise and hear a bit about wildlife connectivity work on the other side of the country.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elise Bennett, and I am the Deputy Florida Director at the Center. I'm a born and raised Floridian, so I'm really passionate about every little tree, plant, butterfly, animal here. And it's just such a pleasure to be talking to you about one of the bigger picture issues we deal with here in Florida, which is wildlife connectivity. It may seem like a bit of a bold choice to begin a presentation on wildlife without a picture of wildlife, whether that be a gregarious scrub jay or, the gopher tortoises are adorable. But I chose this picture of a longleaf pine savanna because protecting habitat is really at the heart of maintaining wildlife connectivity here in Florida. Longleaf pine ecosystems like this one support many rare and imperiled species in the Southeast, from the gopher tortoise to the red-cockaded woodpecker, but they've precipitously declined over the years and now cover only about 3% of their historic extent here in the Southeast. And I think this really highlights how high the stakes are. We're really fighting to protect interconnected fragments of a fragment. It's not letting me proceed. Let's see. Aha. So as you can imagine, sprawl development is one of the greatest threats to habitat and biodiversity in Florida, along with climate change and sea level rise. And if left unchecked, projected development will continue to swallow up habitat and fragment those remaining green and blue spaces in Florida, which reduces connectivity and isolates native species populations, which can lead to things like vehicle strikes on roads, less genetic flow between populations, which ultimately makes them more vulnerable. And so this map here these two maps are pretty interesting. They're projections of what development looks like in Florida. And so the first one on the left is a 2010 baseline of what development looked like in 2010. And all these red areas along the coast in the Orlando metro area are the major areas of development. And as you can see, the trend and projections for 2070 are much more development, a lot more red places. And as you can see, there's just little spots of green here and there. This is a projection if we don't take action to try to better direct our development and keep it more planned and more thoughtful when it comes to habitats and species. I'd like to draw your attention right here to the southwestern part of Florida, and I'm going to come back and mention that again in a minute. So now we get to the adorable species. There's almost no species really that's threatened by habitat fragmentation more than the Florida panther, at least here in Florida. The panther is the last remaining breeding population of puma in the eastern United States. And it once ranged across most of the Southeast. That's that kind of peachy tan area on the map. It includes Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and goes up even into Arkansas, although you can't quite see it on this view of the map. But the sole remaining population, a breeding population, now resides in the tiny green areas that are in the southwestern part of Florida. And as you may recall, that lines up with a lot of the 2070 development projections for the state. So with only about 200 individual cats left in the wild, the panther is still in danger of extinction, and its survival and recovery really hinges entirely on whether we can help it expand beyond this limited breeding range in Southwest Florida. And in fact, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal agency that's responsible for the species' future, says that it has to expand if we're going to recover it. And there has to be connectivity to maintain their genetics. That's a really big concern for the Florida panther. So turning to that idea of connectivity, there are many groups here in Florida focused on wildlife underpasses and overpasses, on land acquisition to form an undeveloped Florida wildlife corridor across the state. And the center fills a unique role in this ecosystem of conservation groups by holding the line for species and habitat. And what I mean by that is we work to try to prevent some of the biggest and most damaging losses caused by development so that those areas can hopefully be protected and become corridors. So for the panther, that has borne out through our work to fight approximately 50,000 acres of development, which is essentially entirely new towns in the heart of panther breeding habitat in Southwest Florida. And we've done this work on two key fronts. First, we've been taking the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to task as it considers issuing this blanket permit that would authorize development in the region, this 50,000 acres, and essentially approve the death, harm, and harassment of protected species in connection with it. And that includes the Florida panther. Now, this work is kind of interesting because it gives you a bit of a backstage pass into the huge effort that we put into any action we do before you ever see lawsuits announced in our press releases or in our newsletters. And so for this project, we've been working for years, reviewing thousands of records, submitting pages of detailed scientific and legal comments to convince the service that it can't legally authorize this massive sprawling development because it would put the panther's future at risk. And what we've really highlighted here is, for one, the obvious thing that it would irreversibly destroy habitat and the footprints of the developments. But perhaps even more concerning is that it would fragment any remaining undeveloped habitat with networks of brand new roads. And these roads will increase the number of panthers killed by vehicle strike to an unacceptable level. And to kind of give you an idea of where we are, just this year, 15 panthers have already been hit and killed by cars. And so you have to kind of sit back and imagine what the number would look like if we're putting brand new towns in their only breeding habitat in the state. It's a really significant concern and something that we have articulated quite clearly through science and law to the agency. And ultimately, we have effectively delayed the approval of this terrible project. And as far as we can tell from public records, we've convinced the service that it can't authorize the development as proposed because it would ultimately jeopardize the panther's very existence. And that hinges largely on the idea that wildlife connectivity will be significantly cut off by these new roads and these new developments. So we are keeping track of that. And ultimately, if the agency does decide to approve this massive sprawl, we're also equipped to go to court and challenge it. So in addition to challenging that sort of broad scale permit I talked about, we're also fighting this interesting, relatively new permitting avenue that developers are exploiting on a project by project basis, which allows them to destroy habitat with weakened environmental oversight. So basically, for decades in Florida, any project that would destroy a wetland had to get a Clean Water Act permit from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which would then trigger this detailed environmental review process under the Endangered Species Act, which is called consultation. And essentially, the purpose of that consultation is to make sure that that development will not jeopardize a species' existence or adversely destroy its habitat. It's a really, we often call it the heart of the Endangered Species Act. It's a really important analysis. And these processes require a science-based analysis. We call it the best available science standard. They also provide opportunities for public participation, and they offer citizens and groups like the center the opportunity to challenge bad decisions in court. But in 2020, the Environmental Protection Agency delegated the authority to issue those Clean Water Act permits to the state of Florida. And this move has largely removed federal oversight of development projects in Florida. We've already seen that the state has been applying this unlawful policy to determine whether it even needs to review environmental impacts. And in fact, there are projects where we're seeing they're just overlooking them entirely. But even when they do look at projects, the US Fish and Wildlife Service no longer completes that formal consultation I talked about. Instead, it offers something called technical assistance to the state. And we've observed that this new kind of review is cursory at best and really doesn't adequately protect imperiled species, in particular the panther, when we're looking in Southwest Florida. So we and our partners sued in 2021. And since then, we've had a small win on motions for partial summary judgment, and we are now preparing to brief the full case sometime in the fall. And so that's our challenge to the overall permitting scheme, which has been really ineffective at protecting panthers. And we think if we can get a success here, it would make a really big difference in terms of what's happening in Southwest Florida and beyond. Now, I know I mentioned that a lot of these are individual projects, and unfortunately, because the center is a national organization, we're largely precluded from participating in state level challenges to individual projects. But that has never stopped us from getting involved and speaking out and supporting our partners, and it hasn't here either. In fact, just last year, we supported our local partners in a project by project challenge by submitting a friend of court brief. And it's a case that our partners at Conservancy of Southwest Florida filed, challenging this large planned development called Rivergrass, which is set right in the panther's breeding habitat. It's very close to Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. There's just a whole lot of problems with this project. And so we came in support, offering a lot of additional information to the court to help support our partners. And the oral argument in that case is set for early August. So hopefully shortly we'll have resolution of that action. In addition to our on the ground work, we're also fighting the Fish and Wildlife Service's plans to weaken protections for the panther. Last year, we had obtained records showing that the service was planning to downlist the panther from endangered to threatened, even though it hadn't yet taken a look at any of the science on the species status, any of the threats to the species, and that's just arbitrary and unlawful. To be clear, there's really no evidence to suggest the panther is no longer in danger of extinction. In fact, if development continues as it has, we are even more concerned about the panther's future. And so we put pressure on the service in the media, and we outed this unscientific and apparently politically motivated decision. And since then, the agency has really backed off. And they've said it's no longer our priority to downlist the species. And we've actually seen that now iterated in their formal work plans. So we've pushed back on this idea of prematurely taking protections away from the panther, which desperately needs them. We also got our hands on an advanced copy of the service's recent status review for the species, and we noticed some really serious concerns, flaws with the science and with the logical conclusions they were making. And we sent a letter and basically pointed out those problems. And that letter has forced the agency to take this unsupported assessment off its public-facing website and go back to the drawing board and revise it. And from what we can tell, it's going to be a significantly better document that's going to provide stronger protections for the panther and support keeping that endangered status as long as the species needs it until it's recovered enough. So we'll continue to keep a close eye on the panther, and we're prepared to fight to keep its protections strong, which, given the massive range that this panther has, will ultimately serve the greater purpose of protecting wildlife connectivity overall. So as a former reptile and amphibian attorney at the center, I couldn't let an opportunity pass me by to talk about the gopher tortoise, which is, I think, one of the most famous Florida species. Everybody here loves the gopher tortoise. And the tortoise is also incredibly vulnerable to habitat fragmentation. It really relies on a mosaic of interconnected upland ecosystems to survive. Oh, I'm so sorry. That's my parabeagle. Currently, the tortoise does not receive strong federal protections under the Endangered Species Act across most of its range, including in Florida. And unfortunately, state level protections here really do very little to address serious concerns about urban sprawl, fragmenting their habitat, and even entirely swallowing up areas that are really important to the species. Essentially, what Florida does is it just moves tortoises out of the way of development, which is a humane thing to do for individual tortoises when compared to what they used to do, which is simply bury them in their burrows. but it ultimately means that the tortoise is getting crammed into smaller and smaller fragmented areas of habitat, and that's bad for the species as a whole. Our greatest concern is that the state really continues to facilitate the sprawling development and is not keeping track of the big picture. That is how much habitat the gopher tortoise needs and how much is left, and whether how much that's left is enough. And this is an analysis the Fish and Wildlife Service is required to do under the Endangered Species Act. And if we get to a point where there's not enough habitat, they have to draw the line and put their foot down and say no. So we've been pushing for federal Endangered Species Act protections for the tortoise by building a strong record for protections through comments and hastening the decision through lawsuits. And we will ultimately have a decision this fall at the latest. And while this advocacy is explicitly aimed at protecting Florida's favorite tortoise, we also recognize that it helps hundreds of other upland species. Tortoises are essentially reptilian architects. They dig these underground burrows in the sandy soil that can be about 8 feet deep and 15 feet long on average. One tortoise can have dozens of active burrows across its little range, and more than 360 species across the Southeast use these burrows at some point in their life. And so if you look at the images on this slide, we've got the threatened eastern indigo snake, the Florida mouse, burrowing owls, the spotted skunk. They all use gopher tortoise burrows. And there's also a really cool recent study about that observed 25 bird species using burrows. And one thing I thought was particularly interesting is many of the species use the burrow apron, which is kind of the pile of sand that the tortoise digs out of the burrow. They used it for dust bathing and for foraging. So just really fascinating the way these burrows offer so many benefits to the entire ecosystem. And so, it's really helpful to protect gopher tortoises, because the habitat protects so many other species, but it's also a particularly helpful strategy because upland ecosystems often don't get the same consideration and protection that aquatic and wetland habitats do. But if we can show the agencies that these upland habitats are critical to a imperiled species like the gopher tortoise and many other imperiled species that rely on it, it gives us a much stronger opportunity to advocate for these species. So that's a little snapshot of some of our work to secure habitat connectivity in Florida. But connectivity is really a part of our overall strategy here, whether we're thinking about the teeny tiny Florida tree snail or the majestic Florida panther. I'm so glad to be able to share a little bit of that with you today and really look forward to answering some of your questions and talking more about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tiffany and Elise, for your beautiful and detailed presentations about the center's work to expand wildlife connectivity across the country. I also want to give a belated hello and thanks to Marcy Olejos, the chair of the center's board, for joining the call today. Hello, Marcy. Now, as time allows, we will open up the Q&A, and this is an opportunity to ask your live questions directly to our panelists. And of course, as always, if we aren't able to answer your question today, we'll be more than happy to follow up by email with answers to your questions for our panelists or for any question you may have for Kieran or other center experts. I'm going to run through just a couple technical details. There are a few options for asking your question. If you've joined us on the Zoom video, you can signal that you'd like to ask a question by clicking the raise your hand icon found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll unmute your line. If you happen to have joined us by phone and want to ask a question, there's 2 steps. First, you'll press *9, and then we'll know that you're raising your hand for a question, and you'll be instructed to press *6 to unmute your line. And you're also welcome anytime to write a question into us by emailing questions@biologicaldiversity.org. And last option, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you can type it right into Zoom, and we'll answer questions as we go. When you do ask a question, please let us know where you're calling from. We'd love to know who we're talking to and where you're from. So with that, please let us know if you have any questions for our presenters. See, I see we have a raised hand by Scott. Go ahead and ask your question, Scott.
Okay. Hello, my name is Scott. I'm calling from Texas. My question is, how do ideas and elements of wildlife connectivity fit in with plans for 30 by 30?
I can start us off. I was trying to be deferential, Tiffany. Um, yeah, I think it's something we think about a lot when we're thinking about what areas we really want to advocate to protect. I mean, one area that really comes to mind for me is the work we've done to advocate protection of the Okefenokee Swamp, which is largely protected by a national wildlife refuge, but we've recently had some threats from mining to the swamp itself. And a key thing that we've talked about a lot with Okefenokee is the fact that it is in some ways an island of undeveloped land in a sea of expanding development in the southeast. And when you're talking about 30 by 30, you're talking about protecting some of the most important places. And because Okefenokee is this unique undeveloped area, because it could be a lifeboat habitat for species as sea level rises and development continues, we think a lot about connectivity and just the way having a big chunk of land like that can help, could connect the south to the north or the east to the west. So I think it's something we think about all the time in our strategy and what we're protecting and how.
Yeah, and I'll just echo and agree with Elise on that one. I feel like sometimes I live and breathe wildlife connectivity. Like it's always on my mind. I'm always looking for it or pointing it out, calling for more. And it's incredibly important, I think, for 30 by 30 goals, particularly for many different reasons, right? Like, as Elise mentioned, a lot of times wildlife connectivity is just straight up the habitat that species need in order to survive. But also having them interconnected with other diverse habitat is really important. Not only for the supporting the species that rely on those habitats and that connectivity, but also as climate changes, as the space and climate shifts and species ranges need to shift, they really need that connectivity so that they're able to shift to wherever they need to go in order to get the resources they need. And so that's just another element, I think, thinking about wildlife connectivity and its importance for 30 by 30, but also, and climate resilience, climate adaptation and climate resilience, which kind of all goes together.
Thanks both. We have a question that was written in. So how can land in Florida and California and other places be protected? Do the developers need to be bought out? And this is from Joanne, and she's in Sacramento.
Tiffany, do you want to start or shall I? I'm sure it's very different. I'm positive it's very different between the two states. I think we're always thinking about any strategy when we look at a particular project. So sometimes buying out is the answer. I think the bigger picture answer in Florida is really having the return of growth management from the top down. And by the top down, I mean the state down. Including state oversight of planning major developments. That's something we really lost a couple decades ago. We used to have a pretty robust planning department. If we think through ahead of time where we're going to put developments, if we redevelop old empty strip malls instead of building new ones farther outside the city, things like that can make a huge difference. And then we never get to the point where we have to fight these ill-conceived developments. So I'd say that's kind of the big picture, but we think about every tool we have at our disposal and what might work best when it comes to the things we work on here in Florida.
Thanks, Elise. Yeah, and in terms of in California, I think similar to in Florida, sometimes the answer is trying to find ways to buy the land or place conservation easements on the land. But there is a lot of private land out there that is being developed. And that's something that in terms of using the tools that we have available to us in California, that includes the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, which allows it requires developers to look at impacts of their development on environmental resources. So that could be biological resources, which includes wildlife connectivity, but it could also be like impacts to water, impact to air quality, impacts to wildfire risk, and the public can engage on that. And so experts in the public and can also engage on that and really provide what the best available science is and why it isn't a good idea to plan developments in certain areas or to change the footprints or to and it just really allows us to push for developers to really look at land use planning, not just in locally, but regionally, and which affects wildlife connectivity and a lot of different species and habitats. And so that's one way we can use CEQA to push for that. And then oftentimes a lot of the lawsuits that we end up filing in the urban wildlands program are based on CEQA issues and non-compliance with CEQA. But then also we are trying to push for more legislative action to really get kind of like a state level requirement to not only protect existing habitat and habitat connectivity, but also reconnect habitat through wildlife crossings, or thinking about in terms of where a good wildlife crossing could go for a road. Sometimes that requires not just a bridge over a road or a culvert under a road, but it also requires habitat on both sides of that road, so that animals are more likely to use the crossing and it actually becomes a functional crossing. And so that oftentimes requires acquisition of land on both sides and then also implementing the crossing. So there's lots of different ways that these things kind of play out, and there are lots of different ways, there are several tools that we can use, and also we're trying to create more tools for ourselves to be able to do even more.
Thank you both. Before going to the next question, I just want to recognize not a question necessarily, but from Susan, who just read Half Earth by Edward O. Wilson, declaring that 30% is not enough for our continued existence on this planet, and about the longer term goal of 50%. And just want to say, absolutely, the center has our eye squarely focused on that longer term aim, past the 30 by 30 shorter term goal. I think our next question here is, lost it, from Kevin in Marquette, Michigan. What state agencies, this is for both of you, in California and Florida, have been most helpful and, on the other side, most hostile to the center's efforts to protect biodiversity?
I can start again. Gosh, I think generally in Florida, we really rely on the strong statutory protections of federal laws, whether that be the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act. And even with those federal agencies, we often have to hold them accountable to meet the requirements that Congress has made for them. Although I will say that I have found time and time again that sometimes even when the agency is hostile, the staff want to be doing more. And so it's a really fascinating dynamic where you're working with, you're maybe, asking for records from scientists that are working in the local offices, and, they want to see more done, but maybe it's just not happening at the higher level. That said, I think the hardest issues we've really dealt with are with state agencies. Florida Department of Environmental Protection is just notoriously bad at protecting wetlands and other, wild places that we have in the state. And that's part of why we've been really concerned about the fact that that Clean Water Act permitting I talked about was delegated to the state. It went to Department of Environmental Protection, where they're applying unlawful standards as they issue these permits, and blatantly so. And so, we're really concerned whenever they're in the mix. I'd say Florida's Wildlife Commission is just kind of hit and miss. It depends on the issue. Sometimes they're very receptive, or at least receptive enough. But, I think a strength the center really has is that we are willing to push for whatever is actually necessary to protect species, even if it might seem extreme by the standards of the agencies. And so often we are the ones pushing our state agencies to do more. We're the ones pushing our federal agencies to do more. And I wouldn't necessarily even see that as hostile, but that's just our job.
Yeah, I would say that that's pretty similar for the California work as well. I guess in terms of state or federal agencies that I work with, it's usually state is California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans. And then also every now and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I will say it's also a mix in California. And I think that has to do with a lot of different things. But for example, with transportation projects and trying to get more wildlife connectivity integrated into these projects where, you know, at the time that a lot of the roads and development were built, we didn't know about all the different impacts to wildlife movement and different species. As we learn more, we're understanding that we put the existing barriers there, and we need to figure out a way to remedy that. And so that's requires a lot of discussions with Caltrans and a lot of trying to figure out, you know, identifying where those areas are, where it's most needed, and having them implement projects for that. And I think, you know, there are some, kind of like Elise said, there are staff at Caltrans, particularly the biologists who are extremely supportive of getting more wildlife crossings in to improve wildlife movement. But it's a little bit tougher at the agency level, right? And so we have some districts that are actually being proactive, like the ramps that I showed you that were leading up to existing culverts. Those were implemented in Ventura County. And so that district has been generally more proactive than other districts throughout the state. So it's a mix, but I think in general, we definitely want to push Caltrans to do much more than they're doing right now. And that's why AB 2344 is so important, because that is the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act, and that would really put more requirements on Caltrans to work with CDFW to implement more crossings, because it is an urgent matter and we want them to do that as soon as possible, because they're not doing enough now. I'll just leave it at that because I feel like I was talking a lot, but I'm happy to expand on other things if folks have follow-up questions.
And maybe I can add just kind of a funny thought to all of this is that I'm sure maybe Tiffany, you've heard it too, but despite the fact that we're often going up against agencies, I have several times had agency staff people on the phone say, I am so glad you sued over this thing. Like, I'm so glad you sued us. And I think that's really fascinating and a testament to the kind of work we're doing, that sometimes we're even enabling agencies to do things that may not be politically easy for them. So it's kind of interesting.
Thanks both. We have a couple hands raised. So let's go first to Marcy, and then next to Bob. You'll be right after Marcy. Looks like you are muted.
Unmute. There I am.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for putting this call together, all of you, and taking time to educate all of us. And I also want to thank our supporters who called in today to both sessions. My question is kind of off the subject of this call, but I wondered if any of you could speak to the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, because I honestly don't know that much about it and would like to know how it might be used and what you think about it.
I'll have to admit, that's not something that I've worked on closely. I think that might be Stephanie Kuros, our policy specialist, who's been working on that. So I hate to tread into waters that I don't fully.
Yeah, no problem.
That might be a great one to fall into a category of extensive follow-up, which we're more than happy to do.
Thank
Any
you.
question we're not ready for live.
This is Paula. I could jump in if you want, just real quick, just for a couple of minutes, because I participated in a conversation recently about it. And what I understand is that, you know, it's been going on for years. It was going on for years, and it was really terrible. And the center had an enormous amount of participation in making it better. And so it is it has improved considerably, and it's in pretty good shape now, in large part due to the center's intervention. For more detail than that, we'll have to follow up. I hope that helps a little.
Yeah, thanks, Paula.
Thanks so much, Paula. From there, I think, Bob, you have a hand raised. We'll jump over to your question.
Okay, am I unmuted now? Okay. I just wanted to thank the center for the work they're doing in northern Minnesota, where I live, near the Superior National Forest. The Mesabi Iron Range is about 100 miles long, and there are not a lot of wildlife corridors through that 100 miles of mining. And right now, the center is helping with a lawsuit to try to preserve over about 1,000 acres of wetland that a copper mining company wants to either destroy or degrade. And we're the home of the timber wolves and lynx and long-eared bats, endangered or threatened species. So it's just a big thank you for helping us so much in this mining issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, and for being a part of that work. And we definitely think about wildlife connectivity in terms of all the ways that we're in the way of wildlife, be it from extractive industry or traps strewn about the environment as well. So really appreciate you bringing that work into the conversation today too. We have a question here specific to California work, Tiffany. This is from Cynthia, who lives in Sacramento but recently moved from Southern California, and is just asking about local activist groups you may know of, or ways to get more engaged in fighting development and endangering wildlife. Also, suggestions for how to take action and get engaged.
Sure, that's in Sacramento. You're curious about, or Cynthia's curious about?
Now in Sacramento, yeah, living
Sacramento.
now in Sacramento, but familiar with Southern California is my read of that.
Oh, but familiar with Southern California. Oh, yes. Okay. Well, thank you for this question. Really exciting to hear that you're interested in getting involved and taking some action on this. There are definitely, well, I'm curious if you're interested in local groups to Sacramento or to SoCal. But I know that one way that's really great to get involved is the center has a lot of different types of action alerts that kind of guide folks on writing letters to senators or assembly members or any other kind of city representatives or council members to really advocate for wildlife connectivity. I know that right now we have a couple of live ones for California residents, actually, for AB 2344. So that's definitely one way you can get involved. And then you can also sign up for other alerts from the center, I think, as well. I know so one of the groups that we sponsored the wildlife connectivity bill with was Wildlands Network. I'm not sure what kind of actions that they promote, but I know that they're a great organization and definitely another group to look into. And I can send you some other a list of other groups because I think I'm not sure I'm answering your question the way you want me to, and curious if you're thinking specifically of the Sacramento area or elsewhere.
We will definitely follow up by email with some links and to learn more on that one. Wonderful. We have probably time for about one more question, and I see that Sandra has her hand raised. Go ahead and unmute your line, Sandra.
Sorry, it took a couple tries. Okay, my question is, with all this work that your agency does, and I see your name everywhere, so you're obviously doing a great job. Anyway, comes to mind is the Bears Ears National Monument. And under one presidential administration, it was so many thousands of acres. And then the next presidential administration reduced its protection by 85%. And then the Biden administration restored it to a greater percent. My question is, how much of your work and legislation victories are subject to political whims with changing administrations, if you can even answer that, or maybe it doesn't apply in the kind of work that you do? And I thank you for your answer.
This is Elise. I would say very, it's impacted a lot. In a way, I should say, you know, I immediately thought of the Florida panther, and I mentioned during my presentation that we got records that said that they were planning to downlist the panther from endangered to threatened. That was a decision that was made under the Trump administration. And at that time, staff under that administration had actually created this policy that they had to pick 30 species to remove protections from or reduce protections for each year.
Oh.
And which is just arbitrary, right? But it was that policy that led to decisions like, well, let's downlist the panther. And you know, certainly decisions like policy decisions like that can change at the whims of an administration. But what's really wonderful about the fact that we have these strong federal laws is that there's always that backstop to say, you know, you made this decision because of your political views, but the statute doesn't allow you to do that. And so it is kind of interesting. I mean, there are things at the state level where we really sometimes have very little control because of the politics, but I think we really enjoy working at the federal level because we have these strong protections we can enforce despite political whims.
Good to know. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Elise and Tiffany. And thank you to all of our Leadership Circle and Owls Club members that joined us today for supporting the center's tireless work to protect species great and small. Your support makes what we do possible, and we're tremendously grateful to you. As a final reminder, we'll email an audio recording of today's briefing soon, and we will have a transcript of the call available upon request. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us anytime with your questions. But thank you from all of us so much again for being here, and have a great afternoon.